If you want to understand the Cleopatra ancestry debate, you do not start with a skull. You start with a family tree that barely behaves like a tree at all, because Cleopatra did not come from an ordinary royal line. She came from the Ptolemies, the Macedonian Greek dynasty that took control of Egypt after Alexander the Great. And over generations, that dynasty became obsessed with keeping power inside the family so completely that brothers married sisters, uncles married nieces, and the same bloodlines kept folding back into themselves. That matters for one reason people often miss. The more closed the dynasty became, the fewer realistic entry points there were for any new ancestry to enter the line. And Cleopatra's branch was about as closed as ancient royal dynasties get. This is the part that sounds almost made up until you actually follow the names. In the reconstructed family tree historians usually work from, Cleopatra did not have the normal 16 great-grandparents you would expect 4 generations back. That web collapses dramatically, down to a tiny number of recurring people. In the popular shorthand version, it compresses to just 6, not because records are sloppy, but because the same ancestors occupy multiple slots at once. So how does that happen? Imagine writing out 16 empty boxes for your great-great-grandparents. Now start filling them with a dynasty that keeps marrying itself. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XVI, was part of a line already shaped by close kin unions. Her mother is uncertain, which we will get to next, but in the most commonly used reconstruction, even that side loops back into the same ruling house. Then one generation higher, the repetition becomes impossible to miss. The same royal pair appears on both sides. Go back again, and another sibling union has already collapsed the branches before that. So instead of a tree opening outward, it keeps snapping inward like a trap. That is why Cleopatra's ancestry debate is not a wide-open mystery with infinite possibilities. It is the opposite. It is a mostly sealed system with a few blank spaces, and that sealed system was not accidental. The Ptolemies did this on purpose. Part of it was power. If royal legitimacy stays inside the family, rival houses have a harder time making claims. Part of it was image. These rulers governed Egypt, but they were a foreign-origin Macedonian dynasty, and they borrowed Egyptian-style divine kingship to strengthen their authority. Marrying within the family helped present the dynasty as something set apart, almost sacred, above ordinary society. But there was a cost. Politically, this made succession vicious. Biologically, it narrowed the line. Genealogically, it means later arguments about Cleopatra's true origins cannot just ignore the family structure and start free associating from a headline. Because once a dynasty has been closing in on itself for generations, any claim of major new ancestry has to answer a very simple question. Where exactly did it enter? Not vaguely, not emotionally, not through modern projection. At what point in the pedigree? And with Cleopatra, those openings are surprisingly few. This is also why the famous debates around her identity get distorted so easily. People hear Egyptian queen and assume Egyptian blood. Or they hear mother unknown and assume the entire ancestry question is suddenly unlimited. Neither move is careful enough. Cleopatra was the ruler of Egypt, yes. But dynastically, she belonged to a house that standard references describe as Macedonian, Greek-speaking in origin, and deeply committed to internal marriage across generations. That does not answer every question, but it does set hard boundaries around the ones that remain. And those remaining questions are concentrated in just a few missing lines, not dozens, a few. That is where the real uncertainty lives, not in the whole tree, but in the blank spaces the tree failed to preserve. The mother, possibly the grandmother, the rare places where someone outside the dynastic loop may have entered and changed the story. Which means before we touch the Ephesus skull, before we get to the documentary, before DNA overturns the entire media narrative, we have to stop at the only places where the mystery was ever truly alive. The closed loop makes the next chapter more important, not less, because when almost every door is locked, the one door left open becomes everything. Now we get to the part people grab onto for a reason. Because once you understand how sealed the Ptolemaic dynasty was, the ancestry question stops being, Cleopatra could have been anything. It becomes, where are the actual gaps? And there are really only a few. The first is Cleopatra's mother. The standard view is cautious for a reason. Cleopatra is securely the daughter of Ptolemy XVI. That part is not the mystery. The uncertainty is her mother's identity. Many historians have treated Cleopatra V Tryphena, the sister wife of Ptolemy VI, as the most likely candidate. But the record is not clean. Cleopatra disappears from surviving documentation not long after Cleopatra's birth period, and later ancient testimony complicates the picture enough that modern references still describe Cleopatra's mother as uncertain rather than settled. That distinction matters. Most likely is not the same thing as proven, and unknown is not the same thing as anything goes. If Cleopatra V really was her mother, then the line stays largely inside the dynasty, and the ancestry picture remains overwhelmingly Macedonian Greek, Ptolemaic, with the older non-Greek elements already known higher up the family line. If Cleopatra V was not her mother, then yes, that creates an opening. But it creates one opening, not an unlimited field of invention. A blank space is an invitation to investigate, not permission to pretend certainty where the evidence fails. Then there is the second gap, which is easier to miss but arguably even more important. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XVI, was himself regarded in antiquity as illegitimate or at least vulnerable on that point. Ancient authors treated his parentage as politically shaky, and modern scholarship still debates who his mother was. That means Cleopatra's paternal grandmother may also be unknown. In other words, even before we reach Cleopatra's own mother, one earlier maternal slot on her father's side may already be missing from the record. That is the second realistic place where new ancestry could have entered the line. So if you strip away modern noise, the debate narrows fast. Not to the entire family tree, not to every generation, to a handful of unresolved women. That is why responsible historians usually speak in probabilities, not declarations. Cleopatra was a member of the Macedonian Greek Ptolemaic dynasty, that is, the secure frame. Within that frame, her mother is uncertain, and possibly her paternal grandmother as well. Beyond that, the evidence thins out very quickly. Some modern writers have floated more specific scenarios, including the idea that one of these unknown women may have come from an Egyptian elite or priestly family. But those reconstructions remain speculative, not established fact. And there is another mistake people make here. They smuggle modern racial categories into an ancient dynastic question and assume the answer must come out in today's language. But the historical problem is narrower than that. We are not asking which modern identity Cleopatra should symbolize. We are asking what the evidence can actually support about biological ancestry inside a heavily inbred ruling house with only a few uncertain maternal links. So here is the honest position at this point in the story. Cleopatra's ancestry is not fully documented. Her mother is not securely identified. Her paternal grandmother may also be uncertain. Those are the cracks in the wall. But cracks in the wall are not the same as proof of what was on the other side. And that difference is exactly how a weak theory can slip in, attach itself to one dramatic artifact, and suddenly get presented to millions of people as if a mystery has already been solved. Which brings us to Ephesus. Because once the public wanted a face, a family connection, and a shortcut through uncertainty, one skull became the perfect vehicle for a claim far bigger than the evidence could actually carry. The object that changed the modern Cleopatra debate was not found in Alexandria. It was found in Ephesus, in Western Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. In 1929, during excavations of the so-called Octagon tomb at Ephesus, archaeologists uncovered a well-preserved skeleton inside a sarcophagus. The excavation leader, Joseph Kale, removed the cranium, took it away for study, and left the rest of the body behind in the tomb. That decision turned out to matter enormously, because from that point on, the case split in two, a skull in academic circulation and postcranial remains that stayed behind and later became separated from it. Very quickly, the tomb itself began attracting historical imagination. The octagon was prominent, unusual, and architecturally striking. Because Arsinoe IV, Cleopatra's younger half-sister, was executed in Ephesus in 41 BC after seeking refuge there. Some researchers began wondering whether this high-status tomb might somehow be connected to her. That possibility was intriguing, but from the start it was still a hypothesis, not an identification. Even the recent reanalysis notes that the octagon's date and its fit with Arsinoe had long been debated. Then came the step that gave the idea its apparent scientific weight. In 1953, Joseph Wenninger published a morphological study of the cranium. He judged the skull to be female and estimated the age at death at about 16 to 17. He also described the individual in language that now sounds almost surreal, suggesting a refined type that might hint at aristocratic status. That old assessment became one of the pillars supporting the later Arsinoe theory, because a young female in a notable tomb sounded like it could fit Cleopatra's sister closely enough for a dramatic public story. And then, decades later, the story exploded. By the 1990s and 2000s, the Austrian archaeologist Hilke Thur argued that the octagon burial could belong to Arsinoe IV. In 2009, that hypothesis broke out of specialist circles and went mainstream through the BBC documentary Cleopatra, Portrait of a Killer. Media coverage amplified the claim fast. ABC summarized the documentary's argument this way: Cleopatra may have been part African, because experts believed they had identified Arsinoe's remains and read the skull as evidence that the sister's mother had African ancestry. Another contemporaneous write-up, reproducing the BBC framing, went even further with the headline "Cleopatra's mother was African." That was the sensation. One tomb, one skull, one half-sister. And suddenly a global headline about Cleopatra's ancestry. But here is the pattern. Interrupt that should stop the whole room. The visual skull analysis carrying this media wave was already resting on a badly compromised foundation. By the time the 2009 interpretation was being publicized, the cranium was not even physically available to the researchers promoting the Arsinoe reconstruction. The New Scientific Reports paper states that the 2009 poster and facial reconstruction proceeded even though the skull was neither physically nor virtually accessible at the time, except through the few images published back in 1953. In other words, one of the most famous visual reconstructions in the Cleopatra debate was built from old photographs and inherited assumptions, not from direct modern analysis of the skull itself. And the inherited assumptions were not just a little off, they were wrong at the most basic level. The modern reanalysis found that Wenninger's old morphology-based judgment had misidentified the individual's sex and age. The skull was not a 16 or 17-year-old female aristocrat. It belonged to a male, and dental and cranial development place him around 11 to 14 years old. The paper also found major asymmetries and developmental abnormalities that directly contradict the older impression of a normally developed, distinguished young woman. So before DNA ever entered the story, the dramatic ancestry claim already had a structural problem. It depended on an identity that had never been confirmed, a skull that was unavailable during the famous reconstruction, and a mid-20th century morphological reading that got the person's age and sex wrong. And once you remember that modern biological anthropology does not treat human race as a set of clean biological categories that map neatly onto skull form, the confidence of the 2009 headlines looks even shakier. The public heard, Cleopatra's family secret has been exposed. What the evidence actually said was much weaker. Maybe this tomb is Arsinoe. Maybe this skull belongs to that burial. Maybe those old measurements mean what we think they mean. And in the next chapter, modern science finally tests those maybes. Not with a TV reconstruction, not with a suggestive face, with micro-CT scanning, radiocarbon dating, and ancient DNA. Then the case hit the wall every historical mystery eventually reaches. Not a better headline, not a more dramatic reconstruction. A harder test. The 2024 reanalysis published in Scientific Reports went back to the actual physical evidence with methods the earlier generations simply did not have: high-resolution micro-CT scanning, direct radiocarbon dating, and genetic testing from both the cranium and bones associated with the same burial. And that matters, because once you move from visual impressions to internal anatomy and DNA, the room for romantic projection gets much smaller. First, the researchers checked whether the skull and the postcranial bones even belonged together. That had been a serious problem in this case for decades because the cranium had been removed in 1929 while other bones were later found in and around the tomb. The team compared genetic material from the cranium and the femur and concluded that they derived from the same person. So the old split evidence trail finally closed. This was one individual, not a historical mashup assembled by assumption. Then they dated the skull. Radiocarbon analysis placed it most likely between 205 and 36 BC. That range is important because it does not solve the identity by itself. In fact, that date window is broad enough that, at first glance, it still leaves Arsinoe chronologically possible. This is the kind of moment where weak documentaries stop and say, close enough. But real science keeps going. A burial can fit the calendar and still belong to the wrong person entirely. And then came the twist that collapsed the whole story. Repeated genetic tests on the skull and femur showed a Y chromosome. Not maybe. Not suggestively. Repeatedly. The individual in the octagon tomb was male. The paper states plainly that the connection with Arsinoe Y5 can be excluded because the individual is a male. The Austrian Academy of Sciences summary says the same thing even more bluntly. The skull and femur both clearly showed the presence of a Y chromosome. At that point, the most famous identification in the modern Cleopatra debate was over. But the researchers did not stop there. Micro-CT imaging and developmental anatomy showed that this was not an adult male either. The skull base was still developing. The dental roots showed ongoing growth. Taken together, the evidence placed the individual at roughly 11 to 14 years old. So, the old image of Arsinoe as a teenage or young adult woman in a royal tomb was not just slightly off. It had missed the person by sex and by life stage. And the skull itself carried signs of serious developmental disturbance. One cranial suture that normally fuses very late in life had already closed, producing marked asymmetry. The upper jaw was underdeveloped and angled downward in an unusual way. The teeth showed abnormal wear patterns consistent with major chewing problems. The researchers discussed several possible explanations, including developmental pathology, but they do not claim a single certain diagnosis. That restraint matters. The evidence is strong on what the skull was. It is more limited on exactly why the boy developed this way. There was one more implication, quieter but devastating. The genetics did not point toward a Ptolemaic princess from Alexandria. The study says the ancestry signal was more consistent with the Italian peninsula or Sardinia. That does not magically identify the boy by name. But it pushes the remains away from the entire media myth that had been built around Cleopatra's half-sister. So now step back and look at what just happened. A claim that influenced public history for years said, "This skull is Arsinoe," and from Arsinoe's skull we can infer something dramatic about Cleopatra's ancestry. But modern testing showed the skull belonged to the same burial remains, that the person was male, that he was only about 11 to 14, and that he had major developmental abnormalities. In other words, the evidence did not merely weaken the old theory. It erased the foundation under it. And once that foundation is gone, a much more uncomfortable fact comes into view. If the most famous physical proof in this debate was actually a Roman-era boy, then what confirmed biological evidence for Cleopatra or the Ptolemaic royals do we have left? Almost none. That is the real vacuum at the center of this story.